The evening sun descended over the hills of Galilee, casting long amber shadows across the limestone walls of one of the finest homes in the district. Inside, servants moved with practiced efficiency, arranging cushions around a low U-shaped table, lighting oil lamps that flickered against the gathering dusk, and preparing platters of food that would soon fill the air with the aroma of roasted lamb, fresh bread, and herbs gathered from the surrounding hillsides. This was the home of Simon, a Pharisee of considerable standing, and tonight he was hosting a dinner that had set the entire town whispering. Simon stood near the entrance of his triclinium, the formal dining room where honoured guests would recline in the Roman fashion that had slowly infiltrated Jewish custom. He was a man approaching his 50th year, his beard streaked with grey, his eyes sharp with the intelligence of someone who had spent decades studying the intricacies of Mosaic law. His robes were clean, his phylacteries properly positioned, his reputation beyond reproach. He had built his life on discipline, on careful observance, on the respect that came from being known as a man who kept every commandment, tithed every herb from his garden, and maintained the boundaries between the clean and the unclean with meticulous precision. Yet tonight, Simon had done something that surprised even himself. He had invited Jesus of Nazareth to dine at his table. The invitation had not come from admiration. Simon was far too cautious for that. Throughout Galilee, this carpenter's son had been stirring up crowds, teaching in synagogues, and performing what some called miracles and others called deceptions. The common people flocked to him like sheep without a shepherd, hanging on his every word, bringing their sick and demon-possessed to his feet. The religious establishment watched with growing unease. Some of Simon's fellow Pharisees had already begun plotting how to discredit him, how to catch him in some violation of the law that would expose him as the fraud they suspected him to be. Simon's approach was more measured. He considered himself a reasonable man, a seeker of truth. If this Jesus was indeed a prophet, and some were making even more audacious claims, then Simon wanted to see for himself. And if he was not, if he was merely another in a long line of false teachers who had troubled Israel, then an evening of careful observation would reveal the cracks in his facade. Either way, Simon would have his measure. The dinner table, after all, had always been a place where true character revealed itself. The other guests had already begun arriving, men of similar standing who shared Simon's curiosity and his caution. They greeted one another with the formal kisses of equals, received the customary water for their feet from Simon's servants, and had their heads anointed with olive oil as befitting honoured visitors. These small rituals mattered. In a world where honour and shame governed every social interaction, the way a host received his guests spoke volumes about the respect he accorded them. To omit these courtesies was to send a message that everyone present would understand. When Jesus arrived, he came without the entourage that often accompanied travelling teachers. A few of his followers lingered near the doorway, but he entered Simon's home with a quiet dignity that needed no announcement. He was younger than Simon had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with the weathered hands of a man who had spent years working with wood and stone. His clothing was simple, his manner unassuming. Yet there was something in his bearing that Simon could not quite identify, a stillness, a centeredness, as if he carried within himself a peace that the chaos of the world could not disturb. Simon greeted him with words of welcome, but the words were all he offered. No servant came forward with water for the dust that clung to the Nazarene's feet from the roads he had travelled. No kiss of greeting touched his cheek. No oil was poured upon his head. These omissions were not accidents. Simon was extending hospitality, yes, but it was a calculated hospitality, one that kept this controversial figure at arm's length. He would feed Jesus at his table, but he would not honour him as an equal. The other guests noticed. Jesus, reclining now at the table in the position that left his feet extending outward behind him, certainly noticed as well. Yet he said nothing of it. He simply reclined, accepted the bread that was offered, and began to engage in the conversation that flowed around the table. The triclinium arrangement that Simon had prepared followed the customs that had become common throughout the Roman world and had gradually made their way into Jewish homes of means. Guests did not sit upright in chairs as later centuries would imagine. Instead, they reclined on cushions arranged around three sides of a low table, leaning on their left elbows, eating with their right hands, their bodies angled so that their feet stretched away from the table toward the walls of the room. It was an intimate arrangement, one that brought faces close together for conversation, while leaving the outer perimeter of the gathering accessible to servants who moved in and out, refilling cups and replacing empty platters. This arrangement also meant that the room was not entirely sealed. Banquets in homes like Simon's were semi-public affairs. Townspeople of lower standing often gathered near the doorways and along the walls, listening to the conversation of their betters, observing the social dynamics that shaped their community. It was expected. It was tolerated. The poor could watch the wealthy eat. They simply could not join them. On this particular evening, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the news that the famous teacher from Nazareth was dining with Simon the Pharisee. They pressed close to the entrance, straining to hear whatever wisdom might fall from his lips, watching to see how the religious elite would receive this man who'd been turning their world upside down. The conversation that evening touched on matters of law and tradition, on the news from Jerusalem where the temple authorities grew increasingly concerned about movements that threatened to destabilize the fragile peace with Rome, on the interpretations of scripture that distinguished one school of thought from another. Simon guided the discussion with the skill of a practiced host, probing Jesus with questions designed to reveal the depth or the shallowness of his understanding. The Nazarene answered with a wisdom that Simon found difficult to dismiss, yet his words carried an authority that troubled the Pharisee. Most teachers quoted other teachers, building their arguments on the foundations laid by recognized scholars. Jesus spoke as if he himself were the foundation, as if his words carried weight simply because he spoke them. Outside the walls of Simon's comfortable home, in the narrow streets where the evening shadows grew deeper and the sounds of the dinner party drifted through open windows, another drama was unfolding. Word had spread through the town with the speed that only scandalous news can travel. Jesus was here, the one they called a friend of sinners, the teacher who did not turn away from tax collectors and prostitutes, the rabbi who touched lepers and spoke to Samaritans. He was dining just a few streets away, in the home of Simon the Pharisee. In a small dwelling on the poorer side of town, a woman heard the news, and something shifted in her heart. She was known in this place, though not in the way anyone would wish to be known. Her name was spoken in whispers, in warnings mothers gave to daughters, in crude jokes men shared when they thought no women were listening. She had made choices, or perhaps choices had been made for her by circumstances too painful to fully recount, that had placed her outside the boundaries of respectable society. She was a sinful woman. The Greek word that the Gospel writer would later use, hamartolos, left little ambiguity about the nature of her sin. In a town this size, everyone knew what she was, everyone remembered what she had done, and everyone had decided that she was beyond redemption. She had heard of Jesus before this night. How could she not? His fame had spread throughout all of Galilee, and the stories that reached her ears were unlike anything she had ever heard. He had spoken with a Samaritan woman at a well, a woman whose complicated history of marriages and relationships should have made her untouchable. He had defended a woman caught in adultery, turning the accuser's stones back upon their own consciences. He had welcomed the broken, the outcast, the ones whom the righteous avoided for fear of contamination, and he had spoken of forgiveness in ways that seemed to crack open the very heavens. Perhaps she had even encountered him before, in a crowd at a distance. Perhaps she had heard him teach about a father who welcomed prodigal children home, about a God who rejoiced more over one repentant sinner than over 99 who needed no repentance. Perhaps those words had already begun their slow work in her heart, breaking through the hard shell of shame that she had built around herself for protection. We cannot know for certain. The Gospel writer does not tell us how she came to believe that this Jesus might receive her. He only tells us what she did next. She moved through her small room, her hands trembling as she reached for something she had kept hidden, something precious beyond measure. It was an alabaster jar, small enough to fit in her palm, carved from the pale, translucent stone that came from quarries far to the east. Inside was perfume, pure nard, transported along trade routes that stretched from the distant Himalayas, worth more money than she could earn in a year of labour. How she had come to possess such a treasure the scriptures do not say. Perhaps it was a gift from a former lover. Perhaps it was her dowry. the one valuable thing she had managed to retain from a life before everything fell apart. Perhaps she'd saved for years, coin by coin, holding on to this single beautiful thing as proof that she was worth something, that her life was not entirely without value. Whatever its origin, she knew what it represented. It was her security, her future, the one thing she could sell if desperation required it. And now, standing in the dim light of her room with the sounds of the evening settling over the town, she made a decision that defied all practical wisdom. She would take this jar to Jesus. She would pour it out at his feet. She would give him everything she had, because somehow, in ways she could not fully articulate, she had come to believe that he was worth everything. The walk to Simon's house was not long in distance, but every step required a courage that most people would never understand. She knew what awaited her. She knew the stares, the whispers, the outrage that would greet her presence in that place. A woman like her did not enter the home of a Pharisee. A woman like her did not approach a rabbi. A woman like her was supposed to remain invisible, confined to the margins where respectable society did not have to acknowledge her existence. But something stronger than fear was driving her now. Call it desperation, call it hope, call it the first stirrings of a faith that would not be denied. She clutched the alabaster jar against her chest and walked toward the house where the lamps were burning, where the sound of conversation drifted into the street, where Jesus of Nazareth reclined at a table surrounded by men who thought they knew everything about righteousness. She did not know what would happen when she entered. She did not have a plan, a speech prepared, a strategy for managing the scandal she was about to create. She only knew that she had to reach him. She only knew that the weight of her past had become unbearable, and that this man, this teacher who welcomed sinners, might be the only one in all the world who could set her free. The night air was warm against her skin. The jar was smooth in her hands. And somewhere ahead, in a room full of people who would despise her, waited the one person who would not. She kept walking. Her story had not begun in shame. No one's story ever does. There had been a time, years ago now, when she was simply a girl in a small Galilean town, with a family who loved her, and a future that seemed as bright as the morning sun breaking over the hills. She had learned to grind grain alongside her mother, had laughed with her sisters in the courtyard, had dreamed the dreams that young women dreamed in that ancient world, of a husband, a home, children who would rise up and call her blessed. She had been taught the prayers, had observed the Sabbaths, had believed that if she followed the path laid out for her, life would unfold as it should. But paths have a way of crumbling beneath our feet, and the distance between the girl she had been and the woman she had become stretched across a wasteland of choices and circumstances that she could no longer fully untangle. Perhaps it had started with a man who made promises he never intended to keep. Perhaps poverty had driven her to desperate measures when no other options remained. Perhaps a single moment of weakness had cascaded into consequences that multiplied beyond her control. The scriptures do not give us the details, and perhaps that silence is itself a mercy. Her specific sins were not the point. What mattered was the weight they had left behind, the identity they had imposed upon her, the prison of reputation from which there seemed no escape. In a village where everyone knew everyone, where family honour was the currency of social existence, where a woman's worth was measured by her purity and her place within the household of a respectable man, she had become something else entirely. She was the woman that mothers pointed to when warning their daughters about the consequences of straying from the proper path. She was the woman that men sought out in darkness, but refused to acknowledge in daylight. She was the woman whose presence at the well prompted other women to draw their robes closer and move away, as if her condition were contagious, as if proximity to her shame might somehow stain their own respectability. The Greek word that would be used to describe her, hamartolos, meant more than simply sinner, in the general sense that all people sin. In the context of a woman in first-century Galilee, it carried a specific and devastating implication. She had crossed boundaries that her society considered uncrossable. She had violated not merely the law, but the entire structure of honour and shame upon which her world was built. And in a culture that offered no pathway to rehabilitation, no mechanism for restoring what had been lost, she existed in a kind of living death, breathing, walking, working, but cut off from everything that made life meaningful. The loneliness of such an existence is difficult for modern minds to fully grasp. She could not worship at the synagogue without feeling the eyes upon her, the subtle movements as people shifted away from her presence. She could not draw water without enduring the silence that fell when she approached, the conversations that resumed only after she departed. She could not walk through the marketplace without hearing the whispers, without seeing the judgment written on faces that never quite met her eyes. Every day was an exercise in the invisibility, in moving through a world that wished she did not exist, in carrying a burden of shame that no amount of time seemed to lighten. And the worst part, the part that ate at her soul in the quiet hours of the night, was that she had internalized their judgment. She had come to believe what they believed about her. She was ruined. She was worthless. She was beyond the reach of redemption. Whatever dreams she had once cherished had died long ago, and what remained was merely existence, a going through the motions that could hardly be called living. She had stopped hoping for anything different. Hope, after all, was a luxury that women like her could not afford. Then Jesus came to Galilee. At first, she heard about him the way everyone heard about him, through the networks of gossip and rumour that connected every village in the region. A teacher from Nazareth was drawing crowds. He spoke with an authority that amazed those who heard him. He healed the sick, cast out demons, even forgave sins, or so the stories claimed. The religious leaders were suspicious, but the common people could not get enough of him. He was different from the scribes and Pharisees who lauded their righteousness over everyone else. He actually seemed to care about ordinary people. He actually seemed to see them. She had dismissed the reports at first. What did any of it have to do with her? Teachers came and teachers went, and none of them had ever had anything to offer someone like her. The righteous had their religion, their rules, their carefully maintained boundaries between the clean and the unclean. She existed on the wrong side of those boundaries, and no amount of teaching was going to change that. But the stories kept coming, and they were strange. This Jesus ate with tax collectors, those despised collaborators with Rome whom respectable Jews avoided like plague carriers. He allowed prostitutes to listen to his teaching, addressing them with a dignity that scandalized his critics. He had told a parable about a shepherd who left 99 sheep to search for one that was lost, and about a father who ran, abandoning all dignity, to embrace a son who had squandered everything in reckless living. He spoke of a kingdom where the last would be first, where the humble would be exalted, where those who mourned would be comforted. He spoke as if God actually wanted to forgive people, as if heaven itself rejoiced when sinners came home. She did not know when the walls around her heart began to crack. Perhaps it was the day she found herself lingering at the edge of a crowd, listening to him teach, tears streaming down her face before she even realized she was crying. Perhaps it was the moment she heard him say, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Perhaps it was the look in his eyes when his gaze swept across the crowd and seemed impossibly to pause on her, not with the contempt she expected, but with something that looked almost like recognition, almost like welcome. For the first time in longer than she could remember, something stirred in the depths of her being. It was fragile, tentative, barely more than a whisper, but it was there. It was hope, and now he was here, in her town, dining in the home of Simon the Pharisee. The news had reached her as the sun began its descent, carried by the same currents of gossip that usually brought only fresh reminders of her disgrace. Jesus was here, tonight, just a few streets away. She stood in her small room, her heart pounding against her ribs, her mind racing through possibilities and impossibilities. She could not go to him. The thought was absurd. Simon's house? The home of a Pharisee surrounded by the most respectable men in town? She would be recognized the moment she crossed the threshold. She would be stopped, turned away, publicly humiliated. Even if she somehow made it inside, what would she do? What would she say? She had no right to approach a rabbi. She had no standing to speak in such company. She was nobody. She was less than nobody. But the stirring in her heart would not be silenced. It pushed back against every rational objection, every voice of caution and self-preservation. When would she have another chance? How often did Jesus pass through this town? What if this was her only opportunity, and she let it slip away because she was afraid of what people would think? People already thought the worst of her. She had nothing left to lose. Her eyes fell on the alabaster jar. It sat where she had kept it for years, wrapped in cloth, hidden away like the last fragment of a former life. The pale stone seemed almost to glow in the fading light, smooth and cool and impossibly precious. She knew exactly what it contained. Pure nard, the perfume that came from the mountains at the edge of the world, worth more than 300 denarii, a full year's wages for a common labourer. She did not know how much it would sell for now, but she knew it was the most valuable thing she possessed. It was, in fact, the only valuable thing she possessed. She had thought of selling it many times. There had been seasons of desperate hunger when the money it would bring could have made the difference between survival and starvation. But something had always held her back. This jar was proof that she had once been someone, that her life had once held promise, that she was more than what she had become. To sell it would be to surrender the last piece of herself that remained untainted by her failures. Now, standing in the gathering darkness with the news of Jesus burning in her mind, she understood what she had been saving it for. Not for security, not for emergencies, not for some imagined future that would never come. She had been saving it for this, for him, for the one person who might receive what she had to offer without demanding something shameful in return. For the teacher who spoke of forgiveness as if it were actually possible, as if even someone like her could find her way back to God. Her hands trembled as she lifted the jar from its hiding place. It was lighter than she remembered, or perhaps she was simply more aware of its fragility. This delicate vessel that could shatter with a single careless motion, spilling its precious contents across the floor. She cradled it against her chest, feeling the cool stone against her skin, and made her decision. She would go to him. She would give him everything she had, and whatever happened next, at least she would know that she had tried. The streets were quieter now, the bustle of daytime commerce giving way to the more subdued rhythms of evening. Families gathered in their homes for the final meal of the day. Children's voices drifted from courtyards. Oil lamps began to flicker in windows, casting warm rectangles of light onto the darkening paths. She moved through this familiar landscape like a ghost, clutching her jar, trying not to think about what awaited her at the end of this journey. Simon's house announced itself long before she reached it. The sounds of conversation and occasional laughter spilled into the street, the unmistakable atmosphere of a banquet in progress. Torches burned near the entrance, illuminating the small crowd of onlookers who had gathered to watch the proceedings from the margins. She recognized some of them: labourers, merchants, curious neighbours drawn by the presence of the famous teacher. They paid her little attention as she approached. In the darkness, wrapped in her shawl, she was just another face in the crowd. But she was not here to watch from the margins. The entrance to the triclinium lay open, as was customary for such gatherings. Through the doorway she could see the scene inside, the low table laden with food, the guests reclining on their cushions, the servants moving quietly along the edges of the room. And there, in the position of a guest rather than the host, reclined the man she had come to find. Even from this distance she recognized him. There was no mistaking the face she had seen in her dreams, the voice she had heard echoing in her memory, the presence that had wakened something she thought had died long ago. Her feet carried her forward before her mind could object. The moment she crossed the threshold, she felt the atmosphere shift. Heads turned, conversations faltered. A servant moved as if to intercept her, then hesitated, uncertain how to handle this breach of protocol. She was aware of eyes upon her, curious at first, then widening with recognition, then hardening with disapproval. She heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere to her left, heard a woman's voice whisper something that might have been a curse or a prayer. The weight of judgment pressed against her from every direction, a physical force that made each step feel like wading through deep water. But she did not stop. She could not stop. Something greater than fear was carrying her now, pulling her toward the one figure in that room who had not turned to stare, who had not drawn back in disgust. who simply waited with a stillness that seemed to create a space of calm in the midst of the gathering storm. She was walking toward Jesus. The room was perhaps 30 feet across, but the distance felt infinite. With every step, she shed another layer of the protective armor she had built around herself over the years. The defiance that had helped her survive the whispers and the scorn, the numbness that had allowed her to function when feeling anything would have been unbearable, the resignation that had convinced her nothing would ever change. All of it fell away as she moved closer to the teacher from Nazareth, until she was nothing but raw need, desperate hope, and the alabaster jar clutched against her heart. Simon the Pharisee had stopped mid-sentence, his face frozen in an expression of disbelief and outrage. The other guests shifted on their cushions, pulling their robes closer as if to avoid contamination. Somewhere behind her, she heard the sound of the onlookers at the door pressing closer, straining to see what would happen next. The whole room held its breath. She reached the place where Jesus reclined, his feet extending behind him in the customary position, and there, finally, her strength gave out. Her knees buckled, she sank to the floor at his feet, and all the emotions she had been holding back for so long came flooding out in a torrent that she could not have stopped even if she had wanted to. She was weeping. Not the quiet, dignified tears of polite sorrow, but great heaving sobs that shook her entire body, that made her gasp for air, that released years of accumulated grief and shame and desperate longing in wave after wave of uncontrollable emotion. The tears fell onto his feet, dusty, unwashed, bearing the evidence of the roads he had travelled, and still they came, more tears than she would have thought possible, as if some deep well within her had finally broken open and was pouring itself out without restraint. The room watched in horrified silence. This woman, of all people, was touching a rabbi. She was contaminating him with her presence, her tears, her sinful hands. Every person present knew exactly who she was and exactly what she had done, and here she was, weeping at the feet of Jesus, making a spectacle of herself in the home of one of the most respected Pharisees in town. But she was beyond caring what any of them thought. She had come for one person and one person only, and he had not pulled away. He had not recoiled from her touch. He had not spoken a word of condemnation or called for the servants to remove her. He had simply let her come, and in that silent permission she found the courage to stay. The tears would not stop. She had not planned to weep. She had not planned anything, really. Her journey from that small room to this place had been driven by something deeper than planning, something that bypassed the rational mind entirely and operated from a place of pure, desperate need. But now that she was here, now that she knelt in the dust at his feet while an entire room of respectable people looked on in scandalized silence, the grief she'd carried for so long demanded its release. It poured out of her in waves, each sob drawing up another from some inexhaustible well of sorrow, until her tears fell like rain upon the feet of Jesus. His feet were dirty. That was the first thing she noticed through the blur of her weeping. The layer of dust and grime that clung to his skin, evidence of the miles he had walked along the roads of Galilee. Simon had offered no water to wash them. No servant had knelt to perform this basic act of hospitality. And so the dust remained, mingled now with the salt of her tears, turning to rivulets of mud that traced paths across his ankles and between his toes. She wept, and the tears kept falling, and somewhere in the midst of her grief, a new impulse took hold of her. She could not leave him like this. She could not let her tears simply pool in the dust beneath him. Almost without thinking, she reached up and began to loosen her hair. A gasp rippled through the room. In the world she inhabited, a woman's hair was her glory. But it was a private glory, meant to be seen only by her husband in the intimacy of their home. To unbind one's hair in public was an act of profound immodesty, a violation of every standard of feminine propriety. Respectable women kept their hair covered, bound, hidden from the eyes of men who were not their kin. What she was doing now was adding scandal upon scandal, compounding the outrage of her presence with an act that confirmed everything the onlookers already believed about her character. She did not care. She was far beyond caring. The dark waves fell around her shoulders, cascading down her back, and she gathered them in her trembling hands. Then, bending low until her forehead nearly touched the ground, she began to dry his feet with her hair. The act was unprecedented. It was shocking. It was, in its own strange way, beautiful beyond words. In that culture, feet occupied the lowest place in the hierarchy of the body. They were the part that touched the ground, that accumulated the filth of the roads, that bore the contamination of everything unclean. To wash another person's feet was the task of the lowest servant in the household, a job so menial that Jewish servants were often exempted from it, leaving it to Gentile slaves. No rabbi would wash the feet of his disciples. No host would wash the feet of his guests. The act was reserved for those who had no status to protect, no dignity to maintain. And here was this woman, using not water but her tears, using not a towel but her own hair, the symbol of her feminine dignity, to perform the service that Simon had deemed Jesus unworthy to receive. She was taking upon herself the posture of the lowest slave, abasing herself completely, holding nothing back. Every stroke of her hair across his feet was a statement that required no words. I am not too proud for this. I am not too good for this. Whatever I have, whatever I am, it is yours. The tears continued to fall even as she worked, her sobs quieter now but no less intense. She wiped the dust away, strand by strand, until the skin beneath began to emerge clean. And then, in a gesture that shocked the room even more than what had come before, she began to kiss his feet. Not once, not twice. The Greek text that would later record this moment uses a verb in the imperfect tense, kataphili, indicating continuous repeated action. She kissed his feet again and again and again, pressing her lips against the skin she had just cleaned, each kiss an expression of gratitude so overwhelming that words could never have contained it. In her culture, a kiss was a sign of deep respect and affection. Disciples kissed the hands of their rabbis, subjects kissed the feet of their kings. But this was something more. This was worship poured out in physical form, adoration made tangible, love that could not help but express itself through touch. Simon watched from his place at the table, his face rigid with disgust. The other guests exchanged glances, some looking away as if the scene were too improper to witness, others unable to tear their eyes from the spectacle unfolding before them. The servants had frozen in place, uncertain whether to intervene or simply wait for their master's command. The air in the room had grown thick with tension, with judgment, with the unspoken question that hung over everything. Why is he allowing this? Jesus had not moved. From the moment she first touched him, he had remained perfectly still, neither drawing back from her contact nor interrupting her ministrations. His posture was one of complete receptivity, as if he had all the time in the world, as if nothing happening around him, the stares, the whispers, the mounting outrage, mattered more than this woman and her tears. His stillness was itself a statement, a declaration that what she was doing was not an intrusion to be stopped, but an offering to be received. And then she reached for the alabaster jar. It had remained clutched against her chest throughout her weeping, her hair drying, her kisses, this small vessel of pale stone that contained everything of material value she possessed. Now she held it before her, turning it in her hands, feeling its familiar weight for what she knew would be the last time. The jar was sealed, as such containers always were. Alabaster was prized for perfume storage precisely because its density prevented the precious oils from evaporating over time, but that same quality meant there was no stopper to remove, no cap to unscrew. The only way to release what was inside was to break the vessel itself. She did not hesitate. The sound of cracking stone cut through the silence of the room, a sharp, decisive snap that seemed to echo off the walls and hang in the air long after it should have faded. The slender neck of the jar broke away in her hands, and immediately the fragrance began to rise. Spikenard. Pure nard from the distant mountains of the Himalayas, transported thousands of miles along ancient trade routes, passing through countless hands, before finding its way into this small alabaster vessel in a Galilean town. The scent was unlike anything else in the world. Deep, earthy, musky, with undertones of wood and spice that seemed to bypass the nose entirely and speak directly to something primal in the soul. It was the smell of extravagance, of luxury beyond the reach of common people, of wealth concentrated into liquid form. And now it was pouring out, flooding the room with its unmistakable presence. She tilted the broken jar and let the perfume flow over his feet. The oil was thick, amber-coloured, gleaming in the lamplight as it cascaded over the skin she had just washed and kissed. It pooled in the hollows of his ankles, ran between his toes, dripped onto the cushion beneath him. She used her hands to spread it, working the precious ointment into every surface, anointing him with a thoroughness that spoke of complete and utter abandon. There was no measuring here, no careful dispensing of a few drops to make the supply last longer. She poured out everything, holding nothing back, until the jar was empty and the last of the nard had been spent. The fragrance filled the room. It seeped into the fabric of the cushions, clung to the clothing of everyone present, rose toward the ceiling and spread into every corner of Simon's carefully ordered home. Those who were there that night would carry that scent with them for days afterward, in their hair, on their skin, embedded in the threads of their robes. Every time they caught a whiff of it, they would remember this moment: the weeping woman, the silent teacher, the broken jar, and the perfume that changed everything. 300 denarii. That was what the nard was worth. A full year's wages for a labourer, enough to feed a family for months, enough to purchase freedom from want and worry. She had just poured it all onto the feet of a travelling rabbi, and she had done so without a moment's regret. To the calculating minds watching from around the table, it was an act of incomprehensible waste. To her, it was the only response adequate to what she had received, for she had received something that no amount of money could purchase. She had received hope. She had received the first glimmers of a forgiveness she had believed impossible. She had received a look from his eyes that saw past her sin to the soul beneath, a welcome that asked nothing of her but her presence, a love that did not recoil from her touch, but accepted it as something precious. What was a year's wages compared to that? What was financial security compared to the possibility of being made whole? The perfume was not a transaction. It was not an attempt to purchase his favour or earn his forgiveness. It was simply the overflow of a heart so full of gratitude that it could not help but pour itself out. She gave because she had been given to. She loved because she had been loved. The extravagance of her offering was merely a reflection of the extravagance she had encountered in him. She remained there at his feet, her hair damp with tears and perfume, her hands glistening with oil, her body still trembling with the aftershocks of her weeping. The jar lay broken beside her, empty now, its purpose fulfilled. She had given everything. There was nothing left to give, and still Jesus had not spoken a word. His silence was not the silence of embarrassment or disapproval. It was the silence of one who understood that some moments were too sacred for interruption, that some acts of worship required space to unfold without commentary. He had received her tears, her hair, her kisses, her perfume, received them all with a grace that transformed what the world saw as scandal into something holy. His stillness had created a sanctuary within the hostile space of Simon's dining room, a place where this broken woman could pour out her heart without fear of rejection. The room remained frozen around them, Simon with his mounting indignation, the guests with their uncomfortable shifting, the servants with their uncertain hovering. The fragrance of nard hung heavy in the air, an olfactory reminder that something extraordinary had just occurred, something that would not be easily forgotten or explained away. She had come with nothing but a jar and a desperate hope. She had given everything she had, and now she waited, her face still wet with tears, her heart laid bare, for whatever would come next. The silence stretched on, thick with the scent of sacrifice and the weight of a dozen unspoken judgments. And then Jesus turned to Simon and began to speak. Simon had been composing his verdict from the moment she crossed his threshold. He was a man trained in the art of observation, schooled in the careful categorization of behaviours and their meanings. For decades, he had studied the law and its applications, learning to distinguish between the clean and the unclean, the righteous and the sinful, the acceptable and the forbidden. His entire life had been built upon these distinctions, They were not merely academic exercises for him. They were the architecture of his identity, the framework through which he understood himself and his place in the world. He was a Pharisee, he was separate, he was set apart, and the boundaries he maintained were not arbitrary rules but sacred obligations that defined what it meant to be faithful to the God of Israel. Now those boundaries were being violated in the most spectacular fashion imaginable, and the violation was happening in his own home, at his own table, before the eyes of his most distinguished guests. He watched the woman's display with a revulsion that went far deeper than mere social disapproval. Every gesture she made was an offence against the order he had devoted his life to preserving. Her presence in his home contaminated the space he had worked so hard to keep pure. Her tears falling on the feet of his guests spread that contamination further. Her unbound hair was an affront to modesty. Her kisses were an intimacy that no respectable woman would offer in public, least of all to a man who was not her husband. And the perfume, that extravagant, wasteful outpouring of wealth, was the final absurdity in a scene that defied every standard of proper behaviour. But what troubled Simon most was not the woman. Women like her existed in every town, and while their presence was regrettable, it was at least comprehensible. Sin had been part of the human condition since Eden, and some people simply lacked the moral fibre to resist its pull. What he could not comprehend, what set his teeth on edge and made his carefully ordered worldview tremble, was the reaction of Jesus, or rather, the lack of reaction. Any prophet worthy of the name would have recognized what was happening. The gift of prophetic insight, as Simon understood it, included the ability to perceive the spiritual condition of those one encountered. A true prophet would have known immediately what kind of woman this was. He would have sensed the contamination emanating from her like heat from a flame. He would have recoiled from her touch, commanded her to leave, perhaps even pronounced judgment upon her sins. That was what prophets did. That was how the holy responded to the unholy. Instead, Jesus lay there like a man enjoying a pleasant evening, seemingly unbothered by the fact that a prostitute was weeping all over his feet and wiping them with her hair. He had not flinched when she first touched him. He had not pulled away as her tears soaked his skin. He had not spoken a single word of rebuke as she kissed him again and again, her lips pressing against flesh that should have been protected from such defilement. Either he did not know what she was, which would disqualify him as a prophet, or he did not care, which would be even worse. The thought crystallized in Simon's mind with the clarity of a logical proof. If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of a woman she is, that she is a sinner. He did not speak the words aloud. He was too disciplined for that, too aware of the social dynamics at play. To openly challenge a guest at one's own table was a breach of hospitality that would reflect poorly on the host. And besides, the evidence was speaking for itself. Everyone in the room could see what was happening. Everyone could draw their own conclusions about Jesus' credentials. Simon did not need to voice his judgment. He simply needed to let the scene unfold and allow the Nazarene to condemn himself through his own passivity. What Simon did not realize, could not have realized, was that his silent verdict was itself being heard. Jesus turned his head, and for the first time since the woman had entered, his attention shifted away from her and toward his host. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, carrying the weight of intention. His eyes met Simon's, and in that gaze the Pharisee felt something he had not expected. The uncomfortable sensation of being seen, truly seen, in a way that penetrated far deeper than surface appearances. "Simon," Jesus said, and there was nothing confrontational in his tone, nothing that would give the Pharisee grounds for offence. His voice was calm, almost conversational, as if he were about to share an interesting observation about the weather or the quality of the wine. "I have something to tell you." The room, which had been suspended in a state of frozen attention, seemed to lean in slightly. Even the woman at Jesus' feet grew still, her weeping subsiding to quiet tremors as she listened. Simon inclined his head with the careful courtesy of a host, addressing an honoured guest. "Tell me, teacher," he replied, and if there was a hint of condescension in the title he chose, teacher rather than prophet or master, it was subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability. But Jesus was not interested in Simon's subtle games of status and nomenclature. He had heard the Pharisee's unspoken judgment, had perceived the verdict being rendered behind those watchful eyes, and now he was about to respond in a way that would expose far more than Simon had ever intended to reveal. The response, however, would not come as a direct rebuke. Jesus rarely operated through direct confrontation when indirection could accomplish more. Instead, he began to tell a story. This was his preferred method of truth-telling. The parable, the illustrative tale, the narrative that seemed simple on the surface but contained depths that only revealed themselves upon reflection. He had used parables throughout his ministry, speaking of farmers and seeds, of shepherds and sheep, of fathers and sons. The stories disarmed his listeners, slipping past their defences, planting truths in their hearts before they realised what was happening. By the time they understood the point, it was already too late to reject it. But that parable, the one Jesus was about to tell, would have to wait a moment longer. For the story to land with its full force, the groundwork had to be laid. The contrast had to be established. And that contrast required a careful examination of what had actually transpired in this room, seen not through the lens of Simon's judgment, but through an entirely different set of eyes. Simon saw a sinner. He saw contamination, impropriety, the violation of sacred boundaries. He saw everything that was wrong with the woman and nothing else. Jesus saw something different entirely. He saw a soul. He saw a person created in the image of God, wounded by life, weighed down by failures she could never undo, desperate for a mercy that her world had told her she could never receive. He saw not the sin but the sorrow, not the transgression but the tears, not the reputation but the repentance. Where Simon perceived threat and contamination, Jesus perceived hunger and hope. Where the Pharisee drew back in self-protective disgust, the teacher leaned in with compassion. This was the fundamental divide that separated Jesus from the religious establishment of his day. The Pharisees had built their entire system on the principle of separation. The righteous from the sinners, the clean from the unclean, the worthy from the unworthy. They believed that holiness was preserved through avoidance, that proximity to sin brought contamination, that the godly must maintain careful distance from the ungodly, lest they be infected by their corruption. It was a theology of walls and boundaries, of carefully patrolled borders that kept the dangerous elements safely outside. Jesus operated from an entirely different understanding. He moved towards sinners rather than away from them. He touched lepers and allowed prostitutes to touch him. He ate with tax collectors and spoke with Samaritans. He entered the spaces that the righteous avoided and brought the presence of God into the very places where it was least expected. His holiness was not a fragile thing that required protection from contamination. It was a powerful force that transformed whatever it touched, that purified rather than being polluted, that healed rather than being infected. The woman at his feet understood this, though she could not have articulated it in theological terms. She had come to him because something in his teaching, his manner, his very presence, communicated a welcome that she had never encountered anywhere else. She had risked everything, her dignity, her last possession, her exposure to public humiliation, because she sensed that he would receive her. And she had been right. He had received her tears, her hair, her kisses, her perfume. He had received her. Simon understood none of this. He could not understand it, because understanding would have required him to question the very foundations upon which he had built his life. If Jesus was right, if holiness could move towards sin without being contaminated, if God's mercy could embrace the worst offenders without compromising divine justice, then what did that mean for all the boundaries Simon had so carefully maintained? What did it mean for his identity as a Pharisee, for his confidence in his own righteousness, for the entire system of religious performance that gave his life meaning and structure? It was easier to conclude that Jesus was not a prophet than to consider the possibility that prophethood might look different than Simon had always assumed. But the evening was not over. The silent woman had given her offering. The silent Pharisee had rendered his judgment. And now the teacher would speak, and his words would cut through all the pretense and self-deception, like a blade through silk. The guests around the table shifted uncomfortably on their cushions. The fragrance of nard continued to saturate the air, impossible to ignore, a constant reminder of what had just occurred. Outside, the crowd at the doorway pressed closer, straining to hear what would happen next. The woman remained motionless at Jesus' feet, her face streaked with tears, her hair still damp with perfume, waiting. And in the space between Simon's silent judgment and Jesus' coming response, a truth hung suspended that neither the Pharisee nor his guests were prepared to confront. That the sinful woman on the floor was closer to the kingdom of God than the righteous man at the head of the table. Simon did not know it yet, but he was about to be given a mirror, and what he would see reflected there would challenge everything he believed about himself, about righteousness, and about the nature of the God he claimed to serve. Jesus looked at him with eyes that held no malice, no desire to humiliate, only a profound invitation to see the world and himself as they truly were. A certain moneylender, Jesus began, had 2 debtors. The room fell into a deeper silence, if such a thing were possible. A parable. Jesus was telling a parable, and everyone present understood that parables were never merely stories. They were traps disguised as entertainment, mirrors polished to reflect truths the listener might prefer not to see. The Pharisees had learned to approach his parables with caution, for they had a way of turning back upon the hearer, exposing what lay hidden beneath the surface of respectability. Simon listened with the wariness of a man who suspects he is being led somewhere he does not wish to go. A certain moneylender had 2 debtors, Jesus continued, his voice carrying easily through the perfumed air. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. The figures landed with weight. Every person in that room understood what they meant. A denarius was a day's wage for a common labourer, the amount a man could earn through hours of backbreaking work in the fields or the quarries. 50 denarii represented nearly 2 months of labour, a substantial sum that would take considerable time and sacrifice to repay. But 500 denarii, that was a fortune. That was more than a year and a half of wages, a debt so large that most working people could never hope to discharge it. To owe 500 denarii was to be enslaved to that obligation, to wake every morning under its shadow, to go to sleep every night with its weight pressing down upon the chest. Jesus paused, letting the numbers settle into his listeners' minds before delivering the next element of the story. When they could not pay, he said, he cancelled the debt of both. The Greek word he used, ekarisato, carried connotations that went beyond simple financial cancellation. It was related to charis, the word for grace, for unmerited favour, for gift. The moneylender had not merely written off a bad investment or accepted a partial payment in lieu of the full amount. He had freely forgiven what was owed, absorbing the loss himself, releasing both debtors from obligations they could never have fulfilled. It was an act of extraordinary generosity, the kind of gesture that transformed not just ledgers, but relationships. And then came the question, the inevitable question that would spring the trap. Now which of them will love him more? Simon shifted on his cushion. He could see where this was heading, could feel the ground beneath his argument beginning to soften and give way. The question was simple, almost insultingly so. Any child could answer it, and yet to answer it was to step into a snare from which there would be no easy escape. He took his time, choosing his words with the precision of a man navigating a field scattered with hidden stones. "I suppose," he said slowly, and the hedge in his language was audible to everyone present. "The one who had the bigger debt forgiven, I suppose, not certainly or obviously or of course." Simon was conceding the point while simultaneously distancing himself from it, acknowledging the logic of the answer while refusing to embrace its implications with any enthusiasm. He knew he was correct. He also knew that being correct was about to cost him something. Jesus nodded, and there was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction at having cornered his host. His face held only a kind of gentle gravity, the look of a physician about to deliver a diagnosis that would be painful but necessary. "You have judged correctly," he said. Then he turned. The movement was deliberate, weighted with significance. Throughout the woman's entire display, the weeping, the hair, the kisses, the perfume, Jesus had remained oriented toward the table, receiving her ministrations without directly acknowledging her presence to the room. Now, for the first time, he turned his body toward her, giving her his full attention in a gesture that elevated her from peripheral scandal to central figure. He was honouring her with his regard, making her visible in a way that forced everyone else to see her too, not as an embarrassment to be ignored, but as a person whose actions carried meaning. He turned toward the woman, but he spoke to Simon. "Do you see this woman?" The question cut deeper than it appeared. Of course Simon saw her. He had been seeing her from the moment she crossed his threshold, cataloguing her offences, calculating the contamination she brought, judging her with every breath. He had seen nothing but this woman for the past quarter hour. But Jesus was asking a different kind of seeing. He was asking whether Simon had truly perceived her, not as a category, not as a type, not as a representative of the class of sinners from whom respectable people kept their distance, but as a human being, as a person with a history and a hunger and a desperate need for grace, as someone created in the image of God, however marred that image might have become. Simon had looked at her constantly. He had not seen her at all. And now Jesus would show him what he had missed by drawing a contrast so sharp and so personal that there would be no escaping its implications. "I came into your house," Jesus said, and his voice carried no accusation, only the calm recitation of facts that everyone present could verify. "You did not give me any water for my feet." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. Water for the feet was the most basic element of hospitality. The minimum courtesy extended to any guest who had travelled dusty roads to reach one's door. Servants performed this task as a matter of course. Hosts ensured it was done as a matter of honour. Simon had not merely neglected this custom, he had deliberately omitted it, sending a message about the level of respect he accorded this particular visitor. Everyone in the room had noticed. No one had said anything. Now Jesus was saying it, bringing the slight into the open where it could no longer be politely ignored. "But she," Jesus continued, his gaze still resting on the woman who knelt trembling at his feet, "wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair." The contrast was complete. Simon had offered nothing. She had offered everything. Simon had withheld a basin of water and a servant's labour. She had given her own tears and her own dignity. The most basic courtesy versus the most extravagant devotion, and the Pharisee's negligence was exposed by the sinful woman's abundance. But Jesus was not finished. There were more omissions to enumerate, more failures to set alongside her gifts. "You did not give me a kiss." Again, the baseline of expected behaviour. A kiss of greeting was standard practice when welcoming a respected guest, a gesture of warmth, of acknowledgement, of honour. Equals exchanged kisses on the cheek. Disciples kissed the hands of their teachers. Hosts kissed the guests they wished to honour. Simon had withheld even this simple touch, maintaining his careful distance, protecting himself from too close an association with this controversial figure. But this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. Has not stopped. The continuous action, the unrelenting outpouring of affection and reverence. She had not offered a single perfunctory kiss and retreated. She had remained at his feet, pressing her lips to his skin again and again, as if she could not help herself, as if the gratitude inside her demanded physical expression and would not be satisfied with half measures. Her kisses had continued throughout the entire evening, a sustained act of worship that made Simon's single omitted greeting look like the miserly withholding it truly was. "You did not put oil on my head." The third element of hospitality, the anointing with olive oil that refreshed and honoured a guest after their journey. It was not as essential as the water or the kiss, but it was common enough among hosts who wished to convey genuine welcome. Simon had not bothered. The oversight might have been excusable on its own, but accumulated with the others, it formed a pattern too clear to deny. Simon had invited Jesus to his table, while withholding every gesture of authentic welcome. He had offered proximity without honour, presence without warmth. But she has poured perfume on my feet. Not olive oil, the common courtesy. Perfume. Nard. A year's wages in liquid form, poured out without reservation on the lowest part of his body. Simon's absent oil for the head versus her abundant perfume for the feet. And yet somehow, impossibly, her offering to the lowest was greater than his omission at the highest. She had taken what was precious and spent it lavishly on what was humble. while he had withheld what was common from what should have been honoured. The three contrasts formed a devastating progression, each one building on the last, each one exposing the gap between Simon's careful religion and the woman's careless love. Water, kiss, oil, the duties of a host. Tears, kisses, perfume, the offerings of a worshipper. Simon had discharged none of the former. She had exceeded all of the latter, and the verdict was now unavoidable, spoken not by Jesus but by the evidence itself. But the deepest cut was yet to come. Jesus had established the contrast. Now he would reveal its meaning. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. The grammar of this statement was precise, and its precision carried theological weight that would echo through centuries of interpretation. Jesus did not say that her sins were forgiven because she loved much, as if her extravagant display had earned the forgiveness she sought. The Greek construction pointed in the opposite direction. Her love was the evidence of a forgiveness already received, the fruit rather than the root, the response rather than the cause. Somewhere before this evening, perhaps when she first heard him teach, perhaps in an encounter the Gospels do not record, perhaps in a moment of private revelation that touched her heart without public witness, she had experienced the forgiveness of God. The weight she had carried for so long had been lifted. The shame that had defined her had been addressed. The debt of 500 denarii, unpayable by any effort of her own, had been cancelled by grace. And this evening's display, this outpouring of tears and hair and kisses and perfume, was simply the overflow of a heart so full of gratitude that it could not contain itself. She loved much because she had been forgiven much. The extravagance of her worship was proportional to the extravagance of the mercy she'd received. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. The words landed on Simon like stones. On the surface they seemed almost gentle, a general principle about the relationship between forgiveness and love, applicable to anyone who might be listening. But Simon understood their true target. He was the one who loved little. He was the one whose careful, measured, boundary-maintaining religion produced no tears, no kisses, no extravagant outpourings of devotion. And the reason, Jesus was suggesting, was not that Simon was more righteous than the woman, but that he had never truly grasped the depth of his own need. The Pharisee did not think of himself as a debtor. He had spent his entire life accumulating righteousness, observing commandments, maintaining purity, building a spiritual resume that he believed placed him in good standing before God. If he owed anything at all, it was surely a small amount, 50 denarii at most, easily manageable, nothing to inspire the kind of desperate gratitude that had driven this woman to her knees. He had never wept over his sins because he had never truly felt their weight. He had never kissed the feet of mercy because he had never recognized how badly he needed it. And therein lay the tragedy. The woman knew she was a sinner, and that knowledge had opened her to a forgiveness that transformed her life. Simon believed he was righteous, and that belief had closed him off from the very grace he needed most. She was free because she knew she was bound. He was bound because he thought he was free. The parable had become a mirror, and Simon was staring into it, seeing for the first time, or perhaps refusing to see, the reflection of a man whose religion had become a substitute for relationship, whose righteousness had become a barrier to grace. The perfume still hung in the air, overwhelming now, inescapable. The woman remained at Jesus' feet. Her weeping subsided to quiet stillness, waiting to hear what he would say next. The other guests sat frozen, aware that they had witnessed something extraordinary, uncertain how to respond. And Simon the Pharisee, host of this banquet, master of this house, keeper of the boundaries between clean and unclean, found himself in the unfamiliar position of having nothing to say. The teacher from Nazareth had answered his silent accusation with a parable that exposed his soul. And now Jesus turned fully toward the woman, ready to speak words that she had never dared to hope she might hear. She had not raised her eyes to his face. Throughout everything, the weeping, the wiping, the kissing, the anointing, she had kept her gaze lowered, fixed on his feet, as if looking higher would be a presumption she had no right to make. She was acutely aware of her position in that room, the lowest person present, kneeling in the dust while respectable men reclined on cushions, an intruder whose very presence was an offence. Whatever courage had carried her through the door had been spent in the act of worship itself. Now she simply waited, trembling, uncertain whether she would be dismissed, rebuked, or ignored. She had heard Jesus speaking to Simon. She had heard the parable of the two debtors, though the words had washed over her like water, only half comprehended through the fog of her exhaustion and emotion. She had heard him defend her, contrast her actions with the Pharisees' omissions, speak of her as though she mattered, but she had not dared to believe that any of it would lead to what came next. Jesus turned toward her. She felt the shift in his attention like a change in the air, a warmth that seemed to radiate from his direction and settle over her like a garment. And then he spoke, not to Simon, not to the watching guests, but to her, directly to her, the woman nobody wanted to see, the sinner everyone wished would disappear. Your sins are forgiven. 4 words, 4 simple words in Aramaic, spoken in a tone that carried neither thunder nor fanfare, just the quiet certainty of one who had the authority to say them and mean them. 4 words that crashed into the walls she'd built around her heart and brought them tumbling down like the stones of Jericho. Your sins are forgiven. She had imagined hearing those words 1,000 times. In the dark watches of the night, when sleep would not come, and the memories of her failures paraded through her mind in an endless procession of shame, she had fantasized about someone, anyone, speaking release over her bondage. She had wondered what it would feel like to be clean again, to be free of the weight that pressed down on her shoulders every waking moment, to walk through the streets of her town without carrying the invisible burden of her past. But fantasies were one thing. She had never truly believed it was possible. Not for someone like her, not after everything she had done. And now, a man was looking at her, truly looking at her, seeing past all the layers of sin and shame to something beneath that was still worth addressing. And he was speaking forgiveness over her, as though it were the simplest thing in the world, as though her mountain of debt could be cancelled with a word, as though grace were not a scarce resource to be hoarded and rationed, but an inexhaustible fountain that flowed freely to anyone desperate enough to ask. The tears came again, but they were different now. The weeping that had soaked his feet had been the tears of sorrow, of repentance, of accumulated grief finally finding release. These new tears were something else entirely. They were the tears of relief, of joy, of a prisoner hearing the cell door swing open after years of captivity. They streamed down her face unchecked, and for the first time that evening, she did not try to use them for any purpose. She simply let them fall, the overflow of a heart that was being remade in real time. Around the table, the reaction was immediate and electric. The other guests exchanged glances of shock and consternation, their eyes wide with a mixture of offence and bewilderment. They had watched this evening's drama unfold with growing discomfort, but this was something else entirely. This crossed a line that none of them had anticipated. Who is this who even forgives sins? The question rippled through the room in whispers and murmurs, passing from one guest to another like a flame jumping between dry leaves. It was the question that mattered more than any other, the question that Jesus' words had inevitably provoked, and everyone present understood its weight. In the theology of first-century Judaism, the forgiveness of sins was God's prerogative alone. Human beings could offer sacrifices at the temple, could follow the prescribed rituals of atonement, could seek reconciliation with those they had wronged. But the actual cancellation of the debt that sin created between a person and their creator, that was something only God could do. The priests served as intermediaries. The sacrificial system provided the framework, but the forgiveness itself flowed from the throne of heaven. For any mere human to claim the authority to forgive sins was not just presumptuous, it was blasphemous. It was placing oneself in the position of the Almighty. And yet here was this carpenter from Nazareth, this itinerant teacher with no official credentials, calmly pronouncing forgiveness over a sinful woman, as though he had every right to do so. The implications were staggering. Either he was committing an act of supreme arrogance, claiming an authority that belonged to God alone, or, and this was the possibility that made the guests shift uncomfortably on their cushions. He actually possessed that authority. He was either a blasphemer deserving of death, or something far more significant than anyone in that room had been prepared to acknowledge. Simon the Pharisee sat rigid, his earlier verdict about Jesus' prophetic credentials now complicated by this new development. A false prophet would not have known what kind of woman this was. But Jesus had answered Simon's unspoken thoughts, had read his heart with uncanny accuracy, had demonstrated exactly the kind of insight that Simon had claimed he lacked. And now he was forgiving sins, exercising a divine prerogative with the casual confidence of one who did it all, the time. The categories Simon had used to understand the world were proving inadequate to contain this man. But Jesus was not finished. His attention remained fixed on the woman before him, and his next words would complete the work that his forgiveness had begun. Your faith has saved you. The Greek word sesakon carried depths of meaning that no single English translation could fully capture. It meant saved, yes, saved from sin, from judgment, from the wrath that her transgressions had deserved. But it also meant healed, made whole, restored to completeness. It was the word used when Jesus healed the sick, when he cast out demons, when he raised the dead. It described not just rescue from danger, but restoration to full flourishing, the reversal of everything that had gone wrong, the return to the state of wholeness that God had always intended for his creation. Your faith has saved you. Not your tears, though they had been genuine. Not your perfume, though it had been costly. Not your kisses, though they had been fervent. Your faith. The simple act of believing that Jesus could do what no one else could do, that he would receive what no one else would receive, that his mercy was greater than her sin. She had come in faith, trembling and terrified, but trusting nonetheless, and that faith had connected her to a power that could accomplish what all her efforts and all her shame could never achieve. Faith was the channel through which grace flowed. It was not the cause of her salvation. Only God's mercy could provide that. But it was the means by which she had accessed what God was offering. She had opened her hands to receive, and he had filled them with more than she could hold. Go in peace. The final words fell like a benediction, like a blessing spoken over a new beginning. In Greek, porou eis ironen, go into peace. Not simply depart, not merely leave, but go forward into a new reality characterized by peace. The Hebrew concept of shalom lay behind the word, that rich, multi-dimensional idea that encompassed not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of wholeness, well-being, harmony, and flourishing. Nothing missing, nothing broken, everything restored to its proper place. For years she had known only shalom's opposite. Her life had been defined by what was missing: dignity, respect, relationships, hope. Her heart had been broken by her own choices and by the relentless judgment of those around her. She had walked through her days in a state of perpetual fragmentation, pieces of herself scattered across the wasteland of her past, never whole, never at rest. Peace had been a word that applied to other people, to the respectable ones, to those whose sins were small enough to overlook. Now Jesus was commanding her to go into peace. He was not merely wishing her well or offering a polite farewell. He was declaring over her a new state of being, speaking into existence a reality that had not existed moments before. She was at peace. She was whole. She was free. The woman rose to her feet. It was a simple movement, the kind that human beings perform countless times each day without thought or ceremony. But for her, in that moment, it was resurrection. She had entered Simon's house bent under a weight that had threatened to crush her completely. She had crawled to Jesus' feet as one barely alive, desperate for any scrap of mercy he might offer. And now she stood, lifted not by her own strength, but by the words he had spoken over her, transformed from the inside out by a forgiveness she had done nothing to earn. Her hair was tangled and damp, streaked with tears and perfume. Her garments were dishevelled from kneeling in the dust. The broken alabaster jar lay on the floor beside her, empty and discarded, its purpose fulfilled. By any external measure, she looked like a disaster, a woman who had made a spectacle of herself, who had violated every standard of propriety, who would be the subject of scandalous gossip for months to come. But her eyes told a different story. The shame that had clouded them when she entered was gone, replaced by something that the watching guests could not quite identify. It was not pride. She was far too humbled for that. It was not defiance. She had no interest in challenging those who had judged her. It was something quieter, deeper, more resilient. It was the settled peace of one who had been fully seen and fully loved, who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to hide. She looked at Jesus one last time. No words passed between them. None were needed. Everything that mattered had already been spoken. His eyes held hers for a moment, and in his gaze she saw confirmation of everything he had declared. She was forgiven. She was saved. She was sent forth in peace. The transaction was complete. The old life was over. Whatever came next would be built on an entirely new foundation. Then she turned and walked toward the door. The crowd parted before her. The same people who had stiffened with outrage when she entered now stepped aside in uncertain silence, unsure how to respond to what they had witnessed. She moved past them without hurry, without shame, without the hunched posture of one expecting stones to be thrown at her back. Her steps were steady. Her head was raised. She walked like a woman who had just been set free, because that is exactly what she was. Behind her, the fragrance of nard lingered in the air, so strong that it seemed almost visible, almost tangible. It would remain in that room long after she departed, clinging to the walls and the cushions and the clothing of everyone who had been present. For days afterward, Simon and his guests would catch unexpected whiffs of it, in their homes, on their garments, in moments when they least expected it, and each time they did, they would remember this night. They would remember the woman and her tears. They would remember Jesus and his words. They would remember the moment when all their careful categories had been upended by a forgiveness that made no sense and changed everything. The night air was cool against her skin as she stepped outside. The stars had emerged during the hours she'd spent in Simon's house, scattered across the darkness like promises waiting to be claimed. She paused for a moment, breathing deeply, filling her lungs with air that seemed cleaner than any she had ever tasted. The streets that had felt so threatening on her way to the Pharisee's door now stretched before her like an open road, full of possibility rather than dread. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not know how her neighbours would treat her, whether the whispers would stop or merely change their tone. She did not know what she would do for money now that her most valuable possession had been poured out on the feet of a travelling teacher. The practical questions remained, dozens of them, waiting to be answered in the days and weeks ahead. But none of that mattered as much as it would have mattered yesterday, because she was different now. Something fundamental had shifted at the core of her being, and no amount of gossip or hardship could undo what had been done. She had met the one who could forgive sins, and he had forgiven hers. She had encountered the one who could grant peace, and he had sent her into peace. She had poured out everything she had, and in return she had received something of infinitely greater value. She had received herself back, the self she had lost somewhere along the way, buried under years of wrong choices and their consequences, the self that God had created her to be, before shame had twisted her into someone she barely recognized. That self had been restored to her, not because she deserved it, but because grace did not operate according to the logic of deserving. The woman walked into the darkness, and the darkness could not overcome her. Behind her, in the house of Simon the Pharisee, the conversations would continue late into the night. The guests would debate what they had seen, argue about what it meant, struggle to fit Jesus into categories that kept proving too small for him. Some would harden in their skepticism. Others would find themselves unable to shake the memory of what had happened, haunted by the possibility that they had witnessed something genuine and transformative. But she did not look back. She did not need to know what they thought of her anymore. She had heard the only verdict that mattered, spoken by the only voice that had the authority to pronounce it. Your sins are forgiven. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. She went. 2,000 years have passed since that evening in Simon's house. Empires have risen and crumbled to dust. Languages have evolved beyond recognition. The very landscape of Galilee has shifted, its ancient towns buried beneath layers of subsequent habitation, its roads rerouted, its customs forgotten by all but scholars who piece together fragments of a vanished world. Yet the story of the woman with the alabaster jar endures, told and retold in countless languages, remembered in churches and cathedrals and humble gathering places on every continent where the gospel has travelled. Why this story? Of all the encounters recorded in the Gospels, of all the healings and teachings and confrontations that filled the ministry of Jesus, why has this particular moment captured the imagination of so many generations? The woman herself remains nameless, her subsequent fate unrecorded, her voice never heard in Scripture beyond the silent eloquence of her tears. She appears for a single evening, pours out her offering, and vanishes into the anonymity from which she came. And yet her act of worship has outlasted monuments built by kings. Perhaps the answer lies in the universality of what she represents. Every human being who has ever lived knows something of her burden. We have all carried weights we did not know how to set down. Guilt over words spoken in anger, shame over choices made in weakness, regret over roads taken that led to places we never intended to go. We have all known the experience of being defined by our worst moments, of feeling that our failures have become our identity, of wondering whether there is any path back to wholeness from the wreckage we have made of our lives. The woman who entered Simon's house was not unique in her brokenness. She was simply honest about it in a way that most of us spend our lives avoiding, and perhaps that is the first lesson her story teaches, that the path to healing begins with the admission of need. She did not pretend to be something she was not. She did not attempt to sneak into the Pharisees' banquet disguised as a respectable guest, hoping to blend in with the righteous. She came as she was, broken, desperate, with nothing to offer but her tears and her treasure. Her vulnerability was complete. She held nothing back, hid nothing, protected nothing, and in that radical openness she found what Simon, with all his careful boundaries, could never access. The contrast between them remains as instructive today as it was in that first-century dining room. Simon represents the person who believes they have their spiritual life under control. He has checked all the boxes, observed all the requirements, maintained all the proper distinctions between himself and those he considers beneath him. His religion is a matter of performance and appearance, of doing enough right things to establish his credentials before God and man. He does not weep at Jesus' feet because he does not believe he has anything to weep about. He does not pour out extravagant offerings because he does not feel extravagant gratitude. He has settled for a transactional relationship with the divine, measured inputs producing expected outputs, and he cannot understand those who approach the sacred with abandon rather than calculation. The woman represents something else entirely. She has no credentials to present, no righteousness to display, no performance record to justify her presence. All she has is her need and her conviction that Jesus can meet it. Her worship is not calculated but overflowing, not measured but excessive, not proper but passionate. She gives everything because she has realized that everything is what grace demands, not as payment but as response. You cannot encounter mercy of the magnitude she has received and offer back a measured, reasonable acknowledgement. Extravagant love can only be answered with extravagant love in return. This is why her jar had to be broken. The alabaster flask she carried was not designed to be opened partially. It was sealed, its precious contents preserved against evaporation and contamination, meant to be kept intact until the moment of use. And when that moment came, there was no way to access what was inside without destroying the vessel that contained it. She could not pour a few drops and save the rest for later. She could not offer a reasonable portion while maintaining a reserve for emergencies. The jar had to be shattered completely. Its neck snapped. Its contents released all at once in a flood of fragrance that could never be recalled or rationed. There is a theology in that broken jar that words struggle to express. It speaks of worship that holds nothing back, that refuses to calculate costs and benefits, that gives without thought of return. It speaks of the death of self-protection, the surrender of contingency plans, the abandonment of the careful hedging that characterizes so much of human life. When she broke that jar, she was breaking more than stone. She was breaking her attachment to security, her grip on the future, her last defense against total vulnerability. Everything she had was in that jar, and she let it all go. The fragrance that filled Simon's house that night was the scent of such surrender. It saturated the air, clung to the clothing of everyone present, drifted out through the doorways and into the streets. Those who were there could not escape it. For days afterward, they would catch its traces at unexpected moments, a reminder that something extraordinary had happened, that worship of this magnitude leaves marks that do not quickly fade. The woman herself must have carried that scent with her as she walked home, the evidence of her offering embedded in her hair and her skin. And Jesus too would have borne that fragrance as he continued his journey toward Jerusalem, the perfume of a forgiven sinner accompanying him toward the cross. Some scholars have noted the connection between her anointing and his death. The perfumes used for burial were similar to the nard she poured on his feet, and anointing the body was a standard part of Jewish funeral preparation. Whether she understood it or not, her act of worship foreshadowed the sacrifice he would soon make. His own body broken, his own life poured out, his own fragrance of offering rising to the Father. Her broken jar anticipated his broken flesh. Her poured-out perfume prefigured his poured-out blood. The extravagance of her gift was merely a reflection of the extravagance of his, the smaller surrender echoing the greater one that would redeem the world. There is another version of this story, or perhaps a similar incident from later in Jesus' ministry, recorded in the other Gospels. In those accounts, the setting is Bethany rather than an unnamed Galilean town, and the host is Simon the leper rather than Simon the Pharisee. The woman in some traditions is identified as Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, and the anointing takes place just days before the crucifixion. Whether these are two separate events or one event remembered differently, they share the essential elements: a woman, an alabaster jar, an extravagant anointing, and the scandal of worship that defies calculation. In those later accounts, it is Judas Iscariot who voices the objection. "Why this waste?" he demands, watching the perfume pour out with the eyes of one who knows exactly how much it is worth. This could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor. The Gospel of John adds a devastating editorial comment. Judas said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief who helped himself to the common purse. The contrast between Judas and the woman illuminates something essential about the nature of worship. Judas counted coins, he calculated value, he knew the price of everything and the worth of nothing. When he looked at the perfume being poured out, he saw only the denarii it represented, only the transactions it could have funded, only the economic loss its spending entailed. He could not see what the woman saw, that some things are beyond price, that some moments demand offerings that make no financial sense, that love operates by a different calculus than commerce. In the end, Judas would sell Jesus himself for 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave, a fraction of what the perfume had been worth. The one who objected to the waste would commit the ultimate act of undervaluation, trading the Son of God for a sum so paltry it became proverbial, for betrayal at a bargain. His counting mind could never grasp what her worshipping heart understood instinctively, that Jesus was worth everything, that no offering was too costly, that the only appropriate response to his presence was total, unreserved, uncalculating surrender. Jesus defended the woman against Judas's criticism with words that have echoed through history. "Leave her alone. She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them any time you want. But you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." It is a remarkable prophecy, perhaps the most remarkable in all the Gospels. Jesus promises that this unnamed woman's act of worship will be remembered wherever his story is told, that her offering will be inseparable from his gospel, her memory preserved as long as the good news endures. No king, no conqueror, no builder of monuments has received such a promise. The emperors of Rome have been forgotten by all but historians. Their grand achievements crumble to ruins that tourists photograph without understanding. But this woman, whose name we do not even know, continues to be remembered 2 millennia later, her story told in mud brick churches in Africa and soaring cathedrals in Europe and storefront congregations in America and underground gatherings in places where the gospel is forbidden. What she did was beautiful. That is the word Jesus used, kalon in Greek, signifying not just aesthetic appeal but moral excellence, noble goodness, the kind of beauty that reflects divine order. In a world obsessed with utility and efficiency, with measurable outcomes and quantifiable returns, Jesus looked at an act of apparent waste and called it beautiful. He saw in her offering something that transcended economic logic, something that touched the heart of what it means to be human in relationship with the divine. She had done a beautiful thing, and beauty of that magnitude deserves to be remembered. We do not know what became of her after that night. The scriptures offer no sequel, no follow-up account, no report on how her neighbours treated her, or whether she found the new life that Jesus' forgiveness made possible. She steps into the narrative for one luminous evening and then disappears, leaving behind only the fragrance of her offering and the memory of her tears. Perhaps that anonymity is intentional. Perhaps by leaving her nameless, the Gospel writers invite us to see ourselves in her place, to recognise that her story is not merely a historical record but an invitation. We all carry alabaster jars. We all possess treasures that we guard carefully, resources we hold in reserve, parts of ourselves that we protect from exposure and risk. They may not be literal containers of perfume worth a year's wages. They may be our pride, our self-sufficiency, our carefully constructed images of competence and control. They may be our time, our attention, our emotional energy, our willingness to be vulnerable. Whatever form they take, they represent what we value most, what we cling to most tightly, what we would find most costly to surrender. The woman shows us what it looks like to break those jars open. She shows us worship that costs something, that hurts, that leaves us with nothing held back and nothing to fall back on. She shows us that the fragrance of true devotion is released only when the vessel is shattered, that holding on produces nothing but preservation while letting go fills the room with perfume. Her extravagance is not meant to shame us but to inspire us, to awaken in us the recognition that measured, calculated, self-protective religion will never satisfy the soul the way abandoned worship can. And she shows us something else as well, something that Simon could not see from his cushion at the head of the table. She shows us that the ones who love most are the ones who have been forgiven most, not because forgiveness is distributed unequally, but because awareness of our need varies so dramatically from person to person. The woman knew she was a debtor. She knew the 500 denarii she owed could never be repaid through her own efforts. And when that debt was cancelled, when grace swept away what justice demanded, her heart exploded with a gratitude that could not be contained. Simon thought he owed 50 denarii at most, a manageable sum, a minor inconvenience, nothing to inspire tears or extravagance. His lukewarm love was the natural result of his lukewarm awareness of his own need. He was not a worse sinner than the woman, he was simply a more self-deceived one, and his self-deception cost him the experience of overwhelming grace that she enjoyed. The invitation that rises from this story is not primarily an invitation to weep, or to anoint, or to break expensive jars. It is an invitation to see ourselves clearly, to recognise the magnitude of our debt, the impossibility of our paying it, and the incomprehensible generosity of the one who cancels it anyway. It is an invitation to stop pretending that our careful religious observance has earned us standing before God, and to admit instead that we come as beggars, empty-handed, utterly dependent on mercy we can never deserve. When we see ourselves that way, when the fog of self-righteousness lifts and we perceive the truth of our condition, something shifts in our hearts. Gratitude awakens. Love stirs. The alabaster jars we have guarded so carefully begin to seem less important than we thought, and we find ourselves drawn toward the feet of Jesus, not because we have to be, but because we cannot imagine being anywhere else. The fragrance of worship still fills rooms where such surrender takes place. It may not be literal nard from the mountains of the Himalayas, but it is recognizable nonetheless. The unmistakable scent of hearts breaking open, of pride giving way, of love responding to love with everything it has. It lingers in the air long after the moment passes, clinging to those who are present, reminding them that something sacred has occurred. And somewhere, beyond the boundaries of time and space, the one who received a sinful woman's tears on his feet and called her offering beautiful continues to receive what broken people bring. He does not turn away. He does not demand credentials or qualifications. He does not calculate the worth of the giver before accepting the gift. He simply welcomes those who come, speaks peace over their chaos, and sends them forward, into lives that will never be the same. The jar is broken, the perfume is poured, the fragrance fills the room, and grace, as it always has, makes all things new.